Genghis Khan, circa 1162–1227. Chapter 1. A Child of the Steppe. The Mongolian steppe is an ocean of grass. It stretches endlessly in every direction, a shifting landscape of wind, dust, and sky, where the horizon swallows the earth in an unbroken line. In the 12th century, this was no land of comfort. It was a land of wolves and men hardened by hunger, where survival depended on the sharpness of your blade, the speed of your horse, and the loyalty of your kin. Into this unforgiving world, around the year 1162, a child was born who would one day make the world tremble. His name at birth was Temüjin, son of Yasuge, leader of the Borjigin clan, and Hoylun, a woman taken by force but destined to raise a son who would carve his empire in blood. The night of Temüjin's birth was marked, according to legend, by an omen. His tiny hand clutched a clot of blood, a sign interpreted by the Mongols as a prophecy of conquest. A child born in such a way would not live an ordinary life. He would take life, he would spill blood, and he would claim the power of men and gods alike. His mother, Hoylun, though hardened by years of captivity and endurance, cradled the infant with both love and fear, for she understood that the steppes spared no one, not even children marked by destiny. Yasuge, Temüjin's father, was a man of ambition and cunning. As leader of the Borjigin, he sought to weave alliances and power from the shifting loyalties of the steppe tribes. He understood that strength was fleeting in a world where treachery was as common as the changing wind. To secure his son's future, Yasuge arranged Temüjin's betrothal at the age of 9 to Berta, daughter of the Ungirat tribe. Marriage was no small matter among the Mongols. It was both a personal bond and a political contract. Through Berta, Yasuge hoped to anchor his son's future in the strength of allies. But fate is rarely so kind. On a journey to return from securing Temüjin's betrothal, Yasuge accepted hospitality from a group of Tatars, rivals of the Borjigin. The Tatars greeted him warmly with bowls of kumis, the fermented mare's milk beloved by the steppe. What Yasuge did not know was that the drink was poisoned. By the time he returned to his family, his body was already failing. Racked by pain and unable to stand, Yasuge summoned what strength remained to give his son the only gift he could, a command to lead. "Be a strong leader," he told Temüjin, before the poison consumed him.
The death of Yasuge was a catastrophe. The Borjigin clan, once bound to him by loyalty, abandoned Hoylun and her children to the cold cruelty of the wilderness. With no protector, no herd, and no wealth, Temüjin's family became outcasts. They survived on roots dug from the frozen ground, scraps of meat scavenged from carrion, and fish pulled from icy rivers with bare hands. Hoylun, once a woman of pride, now became both mother and hunter, fighting daily to keep her children alive. She reminded them of their father's words, instilling in Temüjin the conviction that he was destined for more than hunger and despair. But the steppe does not forgive weakness, and Temüjin learned this lesson early. He and his brothers quarreled constantly, fighting over food, power, and leadership within the broken family. One of these brothers, Bektar, often challenged Temüjin's authority. The conflict between them grew sharper, until one day Temüjin, unable to bear the rivalry any longer, took an arrow and ended Bektar's life. It was an act of both necessity and cruelty, a choice that stained his hands with the blood of kin. Yet it also revealed something else: Temüjin's will to lead, his refusal to share power, and his readiness to destroy even those closest to him in pursuit of dominance. In these years of hardship, Temüjin grew lean and hard, his body forged by hunger and cold, his mind sharpened by betrayal and survival. He hunted with bow and arrow, learned to ride for days without rest, and understood the way of wolves who stalked the same prey as his family. Above all, he came to see that life was a contest of strength and loyalty, and that in the game of survival, mercy was often a weakness. It was during this time of struggle that Temüjin was captured by the Temüjin, a rival clan. Betrayed by those who feared his growing strength, he was taken in chains and enslaved. His captors humiliated him, fastening a wooden collar around his neck, a symbol of servitude that made even eating and drinking a torment. He was no longer the son of a chieftain, but a boy treated as a beast. Many would have broken under such humiliation, but Temüjin endured. His heart burned with rage, and his spirit remained unbroken. He watched his captors, studied their habits, and waited for a moment of weakness. That moment came when a sympathetic servant, moved by the boy's resolve, aided his escape. Under cover of night, Temüjin slipped from his bonds, killed his guard, and fled into the wilderness. His escape was not only a return to freedom, it was a rebirth. From that night forward, Temüjin understood that he could rely on no one but himself, and that betrayal would always stalk him like a shadow. But he also learned that loyalty, when it was true, could be the most powerful weapon of all.
When he returned to his family, Temüjin was no longer a boy, but a leader in the making. He began to gather followers, not through wealth or noble birth, for he had none, but through the promise of loyalty rewarded. Men of low rank, warriors without clans, and those tired of the endless betrayals of steppe politics found in Temüjin a leader who valued them for their ability, not their ancestry. This was a radical vision in a land where lineage often dictated power. Temüjin began to forge something new, not a tribe bound by blood, but an army bound by trust. The winds of the steppe carried whispers of his growing strength. Temüjin, the boy who had been abandoned, enslaved, and hunted, was no longer just a survivor. He was becoming something far greater, a man marked by destiny, hardened by hardship, and driven by an unyielding will to dominate. The steppe had tested him with fire, betrayal, and hunger, and he had endured them all. Soon, the tribes of Mongolia would feel the weight of his ambition. The world had not yet heard the name Genghis Khan, but in the heart of the child called Temüjin, the empire of the future was already beginning to take shape.
Chapter 2. Betrayal and Brotherhood. The steppe was a place of shifting loyalties, where promises lasted only as long as they served advantage, and betrayal was as common as the rising sun. For Temüjin, the young survivor of abandonment and hunger, this truth was already carved deep into his soul. Yet even he could not have anticipated how far treachery would reach into his life, nor how profoundly it would shape his destiny. After his daring escape from the Temüjin clan, Temüjin returned to his family, not as a frightened boy, but as one hardened by captivity and humiliation. The wooden collar he had been forced to wear still haunted him, its memory a searing brand of shame and defiance. But more importantly, it taught him the lesson that survival was not enough. To live as prey, endlessly hunted and betrayed, was no life at all. To live as a master, commanding loyalty and instilling fear, was the only path forward. But the road to mastery was long. Temüjin, still only in his adolescence, possessed no wealth, no herds, and no great following. His family scraped existence from the land, their survival owed to Hwälin's relentless will and the resilience she had hammered into her children. Temüjin, however, was not content with survival. He had already begun to attract men to his cause, hunters, outcasts, and warriors disillusioned with their own chieftains. They saw in him something rare, a leader who inspired not by birthright,
but by vision. He promised them spoils when victories came, but more than that, he promised recognition. To serve Temüjin was to be valued as more than a nameless fighter. It was to become part of something greater. But the steppe was never safe for long. The Tayichiot had not forgotten the boy who had slipped through their grasp. Their pride demanded vengeance. Once again, Temüjin was hunted, captured, and dragged back into chains. This time, they intended to break him completely. A heavy wooden kang was clamped around his neck, not just a collar, but a massive frame of timber that weighed him down, marked him as less than a man, and made even the simplest movements agony. He could not ride, he could barely eat or drink, and he was paraded before his captors as a spectacle of mockery. For weeks, he endured the torment. Other men might have surrendered to despair, but Temüjin's spirit refused to bend. He studied his captors, noting who showed cruelty and who showed hesitation. Among them was a young guard, sympathetic to the boy's suffering. Whether moved by pity or admiration for his resilience, the guard aided Temüjin in a daring escape. On a moonless night, the wooden kang was broken, a guard slain, and Temüjin fled once more into the wilderness. With every stride into the dark, the boy who had been enslaved shed the last remnants of weakness. What emerged was a young man who would never again accept chains, not of wood, nor of allegiance.
His escape was not only a victory over his enemies, but the first spark of his legend. Word spread across the steppes that Temüjin, son of Yasuge, had survived against impossible odds, defying death and betrayal. To men of the steppe, such tales were not mere stories, they were proof of destiny. Warriors without masters began to seek him out, drawn by his growing reputation. It was during this time that Temüjin forged one of the most important bonds of his life, his friendship with Jamuka, a young noble of the Jadaran clan. Both were of noble descent, both were ambitious, and both had survived the treacherous politics of their world. Together, they swore the ancient oath of Anda, a blood brotherhood sacred among the Mongols. By cutting their skin and mingling their blood, they became more than friends, they became brothers of the spirit, bound to one another by loyalty stronger than clan or kinship. To betray an Anda was a sin against the gods themselves. Together, Temüjin and Jamuka began to dream of uniting the fractured tribes. The steppe had always been a place of endless feuds and rivalries, but what if the tribes could be brought under one banner? What if the Mongols could be more than scattered clans, forever raiding and betraying one another? Such unity seemed impossible, yet both young men were captivated by the vision. And for a time, they were united in purpose. But destiny has little patience for shared ambition. Though sworn as brothers, Temüjin and Jamuka were of different minds in how power should be won and kept. Jamuka, born of high nobility, believed leadership should flow from birthright and bloodline, a hierarchy that placed aristocrats above common warriors. Temüjin, shaped by hunger and abandonment, believed differently. He valued loyalty above lineage, merit above ancestry. To him, a low-born shepherd who proved faithful was worth more than a noble who plotted betrayal. This radical vision began to attract warriors to Temüjin's camp, men eager for recognition denied to them by aristocratic chiefs.
The seeds of rivalry were planted, though the brothers of blood did not yet see how deeply they would grow. For now, Temüjin focused on building his strength. He recalled Borta, the bride promised to him in childhood, and sought to claim her as his wife. She was the daughter of the Ongirat tribe, and through her, Temüjin secured not only a partner, but also the vital support of her people. Borte would become more than just a wife. She would be his confidant, his partner in survival, and the mother of his heirs.
Her loyalty to him, even in times of despair, would prove as unyielding as the steel of a blade. But happiness on the steppe was fleeting. Not long after their marriage, Borte was abducted in a raid by the Merkit, an old enemy of Temüjin's family, who sought vengeance for past wrongs. The abduction was not just a personal blow, but a public humiliation. A man whose wife was stolen was seen as weak, unfit to protect what was his. For Temüjin, this was unacceptable. He would not only reclaim Borte, he would make the world fear the consequences of striking against him. He turned to his Onda, Jamuka, and together they launched a campaign against the Merkit. With Jamuka's forces and Temüjin's growing band of loyal followers, they struck swiftly and decisively, crushing the Merkit and reclaiming Borte. The victory was a triumph, but it also marked the beginning of Temüjin's rise as a true warlord. He had avenged his honor, proven his strength, and bound his followers to him with the spoils of victory. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered between Temüjin and Jamuka. The more Temüjin grew in power, the more his vision of meritocracy clashed with Jamuka's belief in aristocratic rule. The Onda oath still bound them, but cracks had begun to show. Soon, brotherhood would give way to rivalry, and rivalry to bloodshed. For now, however, Temüjin stood at the threshold of greatness. He had endured betrayal, captivity, and humiliation, yet each ordeal had only hardened his resolve. He had escaped the chains of his enemies, forged bonds of brotherhood, and reclaimed the wife whose abduction might have destroyed a lesser man. The boy who once dug roots from the earth to survive was becoming something else, a leader who inspired loyalty through vision and fear alike. And though he did not yet know it, the path before him was already leading to a name that would echo across the world: Genghis Khan.
Chapter 3. Brothers at War. The Mongolian steppe was vast, boundless, and unforgiving. But in its endless horizon, there was no room for two rising suns. Temüjin and Jamuka had once sworn eternal loyalty, sealing their bond as Onda, blood brothers. Yet destiny does not allow two men with such towering ambitions to walk side by side for long. The dream of unity they once shared had begun to split, not in vision alone, but in the very way they viewed the world. At first, their partnership seemed unbreakable. Together, they had defeated the Merkit, reclaimed Borte, and humbled an ancient enemy. Their reputations spread across the steppe. Men flocked to their banners, eager to serve warlords who seemed blessed by heaven itself. But as the camp swelled with warriors, horse herds, and plunder, whispers began to grow among the followers. Whose vision would prevail? Who would truly lead this new confederation of tribes? Temüjin, the low-born noble hardened by hardship, or Jamuka, the aristocrat who carried the authority of his lineage? Temüjin's answer to that question was radical. He broke with tradition, reorganizing his followers not by kinship or bloodline, but by loyalty and skill. Where other leaders gave the choicest positions to their relatives or fellow nobles, Temüjin elevated common men who proved themselves in battle. A skilled archer, even if born to a poor family, might command 100 warriors in Temüjin's camp. A loyal scout might rise above a noble who schemed and betrayed. This new way of leadership sent ripples of shock across the steppes. Some despised it, seeing it as an insult to ancient traditions. Others, especially men long denied power, embraced it with fervor. Jamuka, on the other hand, clung to the old ways. His vision of rule was rooted in aristocracy, in the supremacy of noble families over commoners. Among the steppe tribes, such hierarchy was ancient and familiar. Many nobles preferred Jamuka's approach, for it preserved their privileges and status. To them, Temüjin's ideas were dangerous, a threat not only to tradition, but to their power. The inevitable split came swiftly. One night, beneath the cold glow of the stars,
Temüjin and Jamuka parted ways. The oath of Anda still bound them in memory, but their paths had diverged forever. Temüjin led his followers, about 20,000 strong, away from Jamuka's camp, declaring his vision of a new order. Jamuka, enraged, declared Temüjin a traitor to their sacred bond and vowed to destroy him.
The steppe was now divided. Brother stood against brother, oath against oath, vision against vision. At first, the conflict seemed evenly matched. Temüjin's men were disciplined, bound to him not by blood but by loyalty and belief in his cause. Jamuka's forces, however, were vast, twice the size of Temüjin's, filled with noble families who rallied to his banner. Still, Temüjin's warriors held their ground. His strategies were precise, his organization unlike anything the Mongols had ever seen. He divided his men into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands, creating a structure that made his army as fluid as a living organism. In skirmishes and raids, Temüjin often emerged victorious despite his smaller numbers. But Jamuka was not content with small battles. He sought a decisive confrontation that would crush his former brother once and for all. The clash came near the Onon River, in what would become one of the bloodiest civil wars the steppe had ever seen. Temüjin rode at the head of his men, his banners fluttering like flames in the wind. He knew he was outnumbered, but he trusted in his warriors and in the discipline he had instilled in them. Jamuka, with 30,000 riders at his back, surged forward like a tidal wave of horsemen, arrows darkening the sky as the two armies collided. The battle was chaos, horsemen crashing into one another with lances and sabers, arrows tearing through flesh, the thunder of hooves shaking the earth. For hours the fight raged, and at first it seemed Temüjin's discipline might carry the day. His warriors fought with ferocity, maneuvering with precision, striking hard at Jamuka's lines. But numbers cannot always be overcome by courage. Jamuka's forces, vast and overwhelming, eventually began to encircle Temüjin's smaller army. His men were cut down, pressed on all sides, until the field was drenched with blood. At last, Temüjin was forced to retreat, his vision battered but not broken. The battle was lost, his army shattered. Jamuka had won, but his victory would plant the seeds of his own downfall.
For Jamuka's cruelty was boundless. After capturing 70 young men from Temüjin's defeated followers, he ordered them executed in a fashion so brutal that even the hardened warriors of the steppe recoiled. They were boiled alive in cauldrons, their screams carried on the wind as a warning to any who might defy Jamuka's rule. What he saw as a display of strength became instead a monument to his savagery. Nobles might have tolerated his aristocratic pride, but such cruelty disgusted many. Warriors began to whisper that Jamuka was not a leader blessed by heaven, but a tyrant whose brutality would doom them all. Temüjin, though defeated, was far from finished. Retreating into the wilderness with a handful of loyal followers, he licked his wounds and rebuilt. His defeat became a lesson, sharpening his resolve and teaching him the price of underestimating numbers. But it also gave him something far greater, the moral high ground. Where Jamuka ruled with fear, Temüjin inspired loyalty. Where Jamuka slaughtered, Temüjin rewarded. Men who had once doubted Temüjin now looked to him as the only leader who might bring order to the endless chaos of the steppe. The Anda bond was broken, shattered by blood and betrayal. Temüjin and Jamuka would never again ride as brothers. They were now mortal enemies, each vowing to destroy the other. And though Temüjin had suffered a crushing defeat, the future belonged to him. For from the ashes of his loss, he would rise stronger, wiser, and more ruthless than ever before. The steppe was learning a lesson it would never forget. Temüjin could be defeated, but he could not be destroyed.
Chapter 4: Forged in Fire. The Mongolian winds carried many voices, whispers of betrayal, echoes of defeat, the cries of the dead, and the murmurs of hope. After his disastrous clash with Jamuka, Temüjin could have faded into obscurity like so many defeated chieftains before him. The steppe was littered with the bones of men who had dreamed too boldly, yet Temüjin was not one to vanish quietly into history. Though broken, he was unbowed, and in his heart burned a vision that no defeat could extinguish. He had been humbled, but humility was not the same as surrender. Temüjin gathered what remained of his loyal followers, a ragged band of survivors who still believed in his dream. They had seen his strength, his fairness, and his unyielding determination. To them, Temüjin was not merely a leader, but the embodiment of a new kind of order in the lawless expanse of the steppe. The fire of their loyalty sustained him, even as the memory of their comrades boiling in Jamuka's cauldrons haunted them all. He did not retreat into despair. Instead, he sought alliances. Among the steppe tribes, survival was rarely won through isolation. Kinship, marriages, and sworn oaths often determined the balance of power. Temüjin understood this better than most. He had seen how Jamuka's reliance on nobles had won him numbers, but it was not numbers alone that won empires. Temüjin began to weave a network of alliances that would, over time, shift the balance in his favor.
One of his most important allies became the Kurate, a powerful tribe ruled by the shrewd and charismatic Ong Khan. Temüjin's father, Yasuge, had once aided Ong Khan in a time of need, and now Temüjin sought to revive that old bond. Riding with his small force, Temüjin approached Ong Khan, not as a defeated warlord groveling for aid, but as a son repaying an ancestral debt. Ong Khan welcomed him warmly, remembering Yasuge's loyalty, and agreed to support Temüjin in his struggles. With the Kurate alliance secured, Temüjin suddenly gained a new base of power and legitimacy. He also deepened his ties with other clans through marriage diplomacy. His sisters and daughters were married into influential families, each union binding a rival or potential enemy closer to his cause. These were not just romantic unions, but political bonds forged with precision. To Temüjin, family was as much a tool of statecraft as a matter of bloodline. Every alliance was a thread in the growing web he spun across the steppe. Yet Temüjin did not simply rely on alliances. He continued his radical restructuring of leadership. He organized his followers into military units called Arban, 10, Zun, 100, and Minghan, 1,000, creating a system where loyalty to the commander and ultimately to Temüjin himself, superseded tribal identity. No longer would Mongol armies be a chaotic gathering of relatives fighting side by side. Now they were disciplined, organized, and bound by a hierarchy that answered directly to Temüjin. This innovation began to pay off quickly. With Ong Khan's support, Temüjin waged small but decisive campaigns against rival tribes. He struck the Tatars, longtime enemies of his family, with brutal precision. In one campaign, he captured the Tatar leaders and, in a calculated show of vengeance, executed every adult male taller than the axle of a cart. To his enemies, this was terrifying ruthlessness. To his allies, it was justice. Temüjin's message was clear: betrayal and blood feuds would no longer be tolerated. Order, how harsh though it might be, was the foundation of his rule.
It was during these years of rebuilding that Temüjin's reputation as a leader spread beyond his immediate followers. Word of his fairness in distributing plunder began to attract warriors disillusioned with other chieftains. Unlike Jemuta and the old nobility, Temüjin shared the spoils of war equally, rewarding merit over lineage. Men who had long been ignored by their aristocratic leaders now found a place of honor in his ranks. Slowly, inexorably, his numbers grew.
But the steppe was never at peace for long. Jemuka, still burning with hatred for his former Onda, watched Temüjin's resurgence with alarm. Though he had won the battle, he could feel his grip on power loosening as his cruelty alienated followers. Men deserted him in secret, slipping away under cover of night to join Temüjin. To Jemuka, this was an unforgivable insult, and once again the drums of war thundered across the plains. When Jemuka struck, it was with his usual brutality. He rallied his dwindling but still formidable army and sought to crush Temüjin before his strength could grow further. The battles were hard fought, but this time Temüjin's discipline and alliances gave him the edge. Jemuka's forces, once the terror of the steppe, began to crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. Eventually, abandoned by many of his followers, Jemuka was betrayed into Temüjin's hands. Here was the moment many expected Temüjin to exact revenge for the boiling of his 70 men. Jemuka, bound and defeated, was brought before him. The eyes of Temüjin's warriors burned with the desire for blood, but Temüjin did something extraordinary. He refused to shed Jemuka's blood. Instead, he granted his former brother an honorable death, having him executed swiftly without torture. It was an act of mercy wrapped in ruthlessness. On one hand, Temüjin rid himself of his greatest rival. On the other, he demonstrated that he was not a man driven by personal cruelty, but by the higher laws of loyalty and order. Where Jemuka had been remembered for his savagery, Temüjin would be remembered for his sense of justice, harsh, uncompromising, but not needlessly cruel. With Jemuka gone, the steppe began to tilt decisively in Temüjin's favor. He was no longer a defeated warlord scraping for survival. He was a rising power, a man who had faced ruin and emerged stronger. The alliances he forged, the innovations he introduced, and the discipline he demanded were shaping not just an army, but the beginnings of a nation. The steppe had tested him in fire, and he had emerged tempered, harder than iron, sharper than any blade. His enemies were beginning to realize that Temüjin was no ordinary chieftain. He was something new, something the world had never seen before. And soon, the tribes would have to decide, resist him and face destruction, or join him and share in his destiny.
Chapter 5. The Wolf of the Steppe. The sun rose blood-red over the rolling plains, its light spilling across endless seas of grass and the herds that grazed upon them. For centuries, the steppe had been the domain of shifting tribes, where power was fleeting and alliances as fragile as morning frost. No ruler had ever truly bound the Mongols into one. But now, in the last years of the 12th century, that ancient order was crumbling. Out of the chaos rose one man, hardened by betrayal, tempered by defeat, and sharpened by survival. His name was Temüjin. Soon, the world would know him as Genghis Khan, the Wolf of the Steppe. By the time Jemuka had been swept from the stage, Temüjin's reputation had become unshakable. His army was not the largest, but it was disciplined, efficient, and utterly loyal. His reforms had reshaped the very fabric of steppe warfare. No longer did men fight merely for their clans or kin. They fought for their leader, bound by merit and law. This was a revolution in thought as much as in arms. Temüjin's men knew that victory meant shared spoils, and honor meant recognition, no matter their birth. He was not simply another chieftain. He was becoming the living embodiment of a new Mongol identity. His alliance with Khan and the Kariat continued to be a cornerstone of his rise. But Temüjin was no passive partner. He built a coalition of tribes. the Tatars and smaller clans that flocked to his side. His sense of fairness attracted warriors who had grown weary of the arrogance of other nobles. Mothers whispered his name when speaking of justice. Traders and shepherds spread tales of his discipline, his refusal to let raiders prey upon his people without consequence. Temüjin was becoming more than a man. He was becoming a legend. But power on the steppe was always contested. Khan, for all his shrewdness, began to grow weary of his ambitious ally. Once a protector and friend, Khan came to see Temüjin as a rival. Tensions simmered, alliances wavered, and soon betrayal once again stalked Temüjin's path. In a fateful battle, Khan and his forces turned against him, striking with the intent to end his rise. The clash was brutal. Temüjin's men, though disciplined, were outnumbered. For a time, the old order seemed poised to reassert itself as the Kariat struck hard at their former ally. Yet Temüjin had grown too clever, too resilient to fall into despair. He fought with the ferocity of a wolf cornered but unbroken. Though he suffered setbacks, he emerged from the conflict still breathing, his core followers still loyal. Khan's betrayal, rather than crushing him, only hardened his resolve.
Soon, Temüjin struck back. Piece by piece, he dismantled Khan's power, reclaiming what had been lost and proving that treachery could not destroy him. By 1201, his star was rising so swiftly that no rival could ignore it. His enemies gathered in a desperate coalition to resist him, rallying around Jamuka one last time, who had clawed his way back into leadership among those terrified of Temüjin's growing might. The final reckoning came at the Battle of the Kalka River, where Temüjin's strategies once again proved decisive. He crushed the alliance, scattering his enemies like leaves in the wind. Jamuka, broken and abandoned, sought refuge with Temüjin once more. This time, he asked for an honorable death, and Temüjin granted it, a swift execution without torture, as he had promised long before. With Jamuka gone, a great shadow lifted from the steppe. It was in the wake of this triumph, in 1206, that the tribes convened a great Kurultai, a council of chiefs and warriors. Beneath the vast sky, on the banks of the Anan River, Temüjin was raised high upon a white felt carpet, the ancient symbol of supreme leadership. There, before the assembled tribes, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan, universal ruler. The moment was more than ceremony. It was a turning of the age. For the first time in their long and turbulent history, the Mongol tribes were united under a single leader. What centuries of khans and chiefs had failed to achieve, Temüjin had done. His reforms, his alliances, and his relentless determination had bound the steppe together in a way no one thought possible.
The newly minted Genghis Khan wasted no time in shaping his nascent empire. He codified laws into the yasa, a sweeping code that established order across the clans. The yasa demanded loyalty, outlawed theft and betrayal, and punished cowardice in battle. It also established protections for messengers, merchants, and envoys, recognizing that the lifeblood of an empire was not only war, but trade and communication. Genghis Khan also reorganized his people into a vast military machine. The decimal system of units, 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, became the backbone of his army. Every man knew his place, and discipline was enforced with iron severity. But within that discipline was opportunity. A herder with no noble blood could rise to command thousands if his merit warranted it. This system made the Mongol army not only the most efficient force of its time, but also one of the most loyal. For the Mongols, life began to change.
Raiding and blood feuds no longer consumed their existence. Under Genghis Khan, they became part of something larger. Their horses carried them not merely into clan skirmishes, but toward conquest, wealth, and destiny. The wolf of the steppe had bound them into a single pack, ready to hunt together as one. As Genghis Khan looked out over the endless grasslands of his birth, he knew that the unification of the tribes was only the beginning. Beyond the horizon lay vast kingdoms, wealthy cities, and empires bloated with riches. The Mongols were no longer wanderers scraping for survival. They were a people forged in hardship, disciplined by law, and bound by loyalty. And their leader, the man once abandoned as a boy and hunted as an outcast, was now the most powerful ruler the steppe had ever known. His eyes turned outward, toward the lands of China, the kingdoms of Central Asia, and beyond. The wolf of the steppe hungered, and the world was about to feel his bite.
Chapter 6. The Dragon's Shadow. The morning mist clung to the jagged mountains of northern China like a ghostly veil, hiding secrets that had endured for centuries. For the empire of the Jin, the arrival of Genghis Khan was a distant rumor, a whisper carried by traders and fleeing refugees. Few imagined that the once exiled boy of the Mongol steppe would one day darken their borders, commanding a force that would change the face of Asia forever. By 1207, Genghis Khan's eyes had turned eastward. The Jin dynasty, ruled from the golden city of Zhongdu, now Beijing, was a fortress of wealth and power. Its armies were vast, its walls formidable, and its bureaucrats clever. Yet the Mongols did not tremble before such obstacles. They had been forged in the harsher crucible of the steppe, tempered by betrayal, hunger, and exile. Every soldier in Genghis Khan's ranks rode not merely for conquest, but for survival, honor, and the promise of riches. The first campaigns against the Jin were a mixture of strategy and terror. Genghis Khan understood that brute force alone would not suffice. He used deception, espionage, and psychological warfare to unsettle his enemies. Villages were spared or punished according to their cooperation, instilling both fear and loyalty. The Mongol army was like water flowing over rocks, adaptable, relentless, and impossible to stop once it found a path. One of the most decisive moments came when Genghis Khan's generals, Subutai and Jebe, employed the famed feigned retreat. Pretending to flee before the Jin forces, the Mongols drew their enemies into ambushes where arrows rained down like a storm, and the cavalry encircled them with terrifying precision. Cities that once believed themselves invincible were toppled, their walls shattered, their citizens taken as tribute or integrated into the Mongol machine.
Genghis Khan's conquests were not merely about killing or taking land. He understood the power of knowledge and culture. Scholars, engineers, and craftsmen were often spared, recruited to serve the expanding empire. Maps, strategies, and innovations flowed back to the Mongol heartland, enriching it with wisdom stolen from centuries of Chinese civilization. Yet the war against the Jin was not without challenge. The Jin armies were disciplined, familiar with siegecraft and fortified cities. For every victory, Genghis Khan faced setbacks, ambushes, harsh winters, and the constant threat of internal dissent. But he was relentless. His leadership inspired devotion. The Mongol soldiers trusted him not merely for his prowess in battle, but for his vision of an empire united under merit and law. One night, atop a hill overlooking a beleaguered Jin fortress, Genghis Khan spoke to his generals beneath the stars. The wind whipped across the plains and mountains, carrying the scent of earth and steel.
"The world is vast," he said, voice carrying over the campfires, "but no empire can withstand the unity of a determined people. We do not fight for land alone. We fight for the future, for the law, for the Mongol name. Let the Jin know that the wolf of the steppe is no mere shadow. We are the storm." By 1210, northern China had begun to tremble under his campaigns. Cities fell one after another, and the Jin emperor grew increasingly desperate, offering tributes and seeking treaties. But Genghis Khan, now confident in the cohesion and skill of his forces, pressed forward with a methodical determination. Each victory was meticulously planned, each conquered city a model for future campaigns. Mongol cavalry moved like liquid steel, siege engines tore down walls, and spies inside Jin territories fed information back to Genghis Khan's tent. It was during this period that the Mongols refined their reputation for both fear and diplomacy. Genghis Khan made clear to all that submission without bloodshed was possible, but resistance would bring devastation. Cities that surrendered were integrated into the empire, their people granted protection and opportunity under the Yasa. Those that defied him often met with merciless destruction. This duality, terror and reward, became the hallmark of Genghis Khan's expansion, a principle that would follow his empire for generations.
Amid these campaigns, Genghis Khan began to consolidate his governance. He established administrative centers in conquered territories, appointed loyal commanders as governors, and encouraged trade along the newly secured routes. He understood that conquest was not only about swords and arrows, but also about creating a system where control, communication, and commerce flourished. The Mongol Empire was becoming not just a military juggernaut, but a functioning state with the ability to endure beyond the battlefield. By 1215, the capital of Zhongdu itself was in sight. Genghis Khan's armies surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and isolating the population. The Jin rulers, once confident in their walls and armies, were forced to confront a reality they could not ignore. The wolf of the steppe had become a predator that no fortress could contain. And yet, even as the Jin trembled, Genghis Khan knew that his campaign was only the beginning. China was vast, rich, and culturally complex. The steppe had prepared him for war, but to truly control and influence the lands of the dragon, he would need not just swords, but wisdom, patience, and unshakable resolve. The shadow of the wolf stretched across northern China, signaling the dawn of an era that would change the course of history. Genghis Khan was no longer merely a Mongol Khan. He was a conqueror whose ambition and vision would ripple across continents, shaping civilizations, empires, and destinies. The storm had begun, and the world would soon feel its full fury.
Chapter 7. The March of Fire. The sun rose over the Mongolian steppe like a molten coin, casting its golden glare on the horizon where the Mongol banners fluttered in unison. Genghis Khan's vision had grown beyond borders or kingdoms. It was now a relentless, roaring ambition to bring the vast lands of Asia under one banner. After the victories against the Jin dynasty, the world seemed simultaneously within reach and dangerously unpredictable. Yet he moved forward with the steady determination of a man who had known exile, betrayal, and hunger. A man who had transformed hardship into inexhaustible strength. By 1215, the Mongol armies had perfected the art of movement and coordination. Cavalry units could strike in waves, feigned retreats lured enemies into deadly traps, and spies scouted thousands of miles ahead to provide intelligence that no empire could match. Genghis Khan's reputation alone often opened gates without a fight. Rulers and generals knew the fate that awaited them should they resist.
Yet for all the fear he inspired, there remained a method to his seemingly chaotic conquests. Every campaign was planned with meticulous precision, every victory leveraged to secure the next. The march east into Central Asia was particularly perilous. Harsh deserts, frozen mountain passes, and torrential rivers tested even the most seasoned riders. But Genghis Khan's forces were molded by the steppe. The unforgiving plains of Mongolia had made them resilient, adaptable, and supremely mobile. Every soldier rode with purpose, knowing that retreat was not an option, and survival depended on skill, cunning, and unity. In the year 1217, rumors reached Genghis Khan of the Kara-Khitai Empire, a wealthy and powerful state guarding the Silk Road. Its cities were brimming with merchants, scholars, and treasures collected from generations of trade. To conquer it would not only expand his empire, but also secure vital trade routes and resources. He approached the empire not just with swords, but with the clever strategies that had become his hallmark. Siege engines were built from local timber, reconnaissance scouts mapped fortifications, and envoys whispered promises of reward for those who would surrender. The first clashes with the Kara-Khitai forces were intense. The defenders were seasoned warriors, familiar with the art of war, and the Mongols faced ambushes and sudden counterattacks. Yet Genghis Khan's leadership proved decisive. He inspired loyalty not through fear alone, but by sharing hardships, eating alongside his men, and leading charges into the heart of battle. His presence was magnetic. Soldiers fought with unmatched ferocity under the gaze of a leader who had endured everything the world could throw at him. Beyond the battlefield, Genghis Khan recognized the importance of administration and assimilation. Cities that submitted peacefully were integrated into the Mongol network, their bureaucracies preserved, their craftsmen enlisted, and their scholars recruited to map and codify knowledge. Trade flourished under Mongol protection, and even distant merchants could traverse the steppes safely, their caravans shielded by the reach of Genghis Khan's empire. This was no mere conquest of land, it was a conquest of order, commerce, and culture. One particularly daring operation involved a desert crossing near the edge of the Tarim Basin. Vast sand dunes threatened to swallow men and horses alike, yet Genghis Khan pressed forward. He personally inspected water sources, rationed supplies with careful precision, and inspired his men with speeches that spoke of honor, destiny, and the promise of glory. Against all odds, the Mongol forces emerged from the desert not weakened, but emboldened, proving that no obstacle could deter their unstoppable advance.
As the Mongols moved westward, entire kingdoms reeled in shock. The speed and coordination of their campaigns made traditional armies seem sluggish and vulnerable. The Silk Road, once a collection of independent city-states and empires, now fell under a new order. Merchants, soldiers, and citizens alike spoke in hushed tones of the unstoppable force sweeping across the continent. Genghis Khan had become more than a leader. He was the living embodiment of the steppe's fury and the promise of destiny realized. Amid the victories, however, the man himself remained ever calculating. He understood the necessity of diplomacy, of forging alliances where brute force was insufficient, and of exploiting the internal conflicts of neighboring kingdoms. Envoys traveled ahead of the Mongol horde, negotiating truces, securing guides, and ensuring that when the armies arrived, the path was partially cleared. The Mongol expansion was not merely a war of destruction, it was a war of efficiency, strategy, and unrelenting ambition. By 1220, the Mongols had advanced deep into the heart of Central Asia. Cities that had once believed themselves impregnable fell under siege or surrendered, impressed by the reputation of the Khan and the organization of his forces. Genghis Khan's vision was now becoming reality. A vast network of territories connected by conquest, intelligence, and commerce, stretching further than any Mongol had imagined possible. And yet, despite the glory and victories, Genghis Khan never allowed complacency. Each triumph was but a stepping stone to the next challenge. each city captured a reminder that power could be fleeting. The March of Fire was far from over. The storm he had unleashed would continue to reshape the map of Asia, leaving legacies of fear, respect, and awe in its wake. The world, he knew, was only beginning to understand the magnitude of the empire he was building.
Chapter 8. The Siege of Cities. The thunder of hooves had become a rhythm across the vast Eurasian steppe, a sound that heralded both fear and inevitability. By the time Genghis Khan's forces reached the fortified cities of Khwarezm and Transoxiana, the Mongol horde had transformed from a nomadic army into a siege machine of unparalleled efficiency. No longer was the Khan content with open-field skirmishes. The conquest of cities demanded ingenuity, patience, and a relentless will that could break the strongest stone walls and the most stubborn spirits. Genghis Khan understood the psychology of siege warfare better than most. He knew that walls were not just stone and mortar. They were symbols of pride, authority, and the illusion of security. To crack them, he combined terror, diplomacy, and mechanical ingenuity. Catapults, mangonels, and battering rams appeared seemingly overnight, constructed from local timber and adapted to the unique contours of each city. Scouts meticulously mapped every gate, tower, and weak point, feeding intelligence directly to the Khan's inner circle. The city of Samarkand, renowned for its wealth and culture, became a prime target. Its glittering markets and soaring minarets had once dazzled traders and travelers alike. Yet now, as the Mongols approached, the city seemed to shrink in the shadow of the advancing horde. Genghis Khan offered terms of surrender, emphasizing the safety and prosperity that could follow compliance. But Samarkand's rulers, confident in their walls and armies, refused. The siege began with the rhythm of calculated destruction. Catapults hurled massive stones, and fire arrows scorched the wooden structures within the city. Mongol cavalry circled relentlessly, cutting off supply lines and isolating the defenders. Genghis Khan's strategic genius shone in the use of feigned retreats. Small detachments would withdraw just far enough to lure the enemy out, only to ambush them in the surrounding plains. Every tactic was designed to demoralize, to erode hope, and to turn the city's own defenses into traps. Despite the terror outside the walls, Genghis Khan maintained discipline among his own ranks. Plundering and cruelty were reserved for those who resisted. Those who surrendered were often spared, integrated into the Mongol administration, and offered positions to manage trade or maintain civic order. This duality, mercy for the compliant, ruthlessness for the defiant, made his reputation as both a conqueror and a strategist. Cities that had heard of Samarkand's fall often capitulated without a fight. One of the most dramatic moments came when the Mongols faced the fortified city of Nishapur. Here, Genghis Khan encountered both stubborn resistance and unexpected betrayal from local leaders who underestimated his foresight. The siege was brutal and methodical. Night raids, surprise attacks, and the use of psychological warfare weakened the defenders. Genghis Khan personally oversaw key operations, moving between command points and front lines, inspiring his men by example. His presence was a force multiplier. Soldiers fought not only for conquest, but for the honor of serving a leader who lived among them, who shared in both hardship and victory. By the end of the campaign, entire regions were brought under Mongol dominion. Markets that once thrived independently now operated under the Khan's protection. Roads were secured, communication lines established, and knowledge from captured cities cataloged to strengthen the empire. But even as he celebrated victories, Genghis Khan's mind looked beyond the immediate spoils.
Each city taken was not only a conquest, but a foundation for future expansion, a strategic foothold in the ever-widening empire that stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the rich lands of Persia.
Through these sieges, a pattern emerged. Cities that resisted too long faced devastation, yet those who submitted promptly found themselves woven into a new, ordered world. Genghis Khan's approach was both fearsome and pragmatic, blending the brutality of war with the efficiency of governance. By the time he turned his gaze toward the Indus and the far reaches of the Caspian Sea, his empire had become an unstoppable force, defined by mobility, discipline, and the indomitable will of a man born in the harshest of lands. Even in victory, the Khan never allowed complacency. Each city offered lessons in architecture, supply management, and diplomacy. His army grew more adaptable, his tactics more refined, and his vision of a unified Eurasia increasingly tangible. The siege of cities was not merely a chapter of war. It was a testament to strategy, endurance, and the unyielding ambition of a man who had once been a child in exile, dreaming of greatness beneath the endless Mongolian sky. By the time Genghis Khan's forces rested and reorganized, the world had begun to see the true scale of his ambition. He was no longer simply a leader of nomads. He had become a ruler capable of commanding continents, reshaping civilizations, and leaving a mark on history that would echo for centuries. The steppe had given rise to a storm, and that storm was only gathering strength.
Chapter 9. The Path to the West. The endless plains of Central Asia stretched like a sea of gold and green beneath the sun, a landscape both harsh and deceptively calm. For most, it was merely land, a backdrop for daily survival. But for Genghis Khan, it was the stage for destiny. His gaze, sharp and calculating, turned westward, not just for conquest, but to understand the vast empires beyond the steppe, and to test the limits of his growing dominion. Following the fall of the Khwarezmian cities, word of the Mongol horde's precision, speed, and unrelenting fury spread like wildfire. Many rulers trembled at the mere mention of Genghis Khan's name. Yet the Khan did not march blindly on reputation alone. Every campaign into the western regions, Persia, the Caucasus, and the fringes of what we now call Eastern Europe, was meticulously planned. Scouts were dispatched months in advance, rivers and mountain passes mapped, and alliances sought among discontented factions who might provide intelligence or resources. One of the first major confrontations came at the Oxus River, a natural barrier that separated the fertile lands of Central Asia from the steppes. The river, swollen from seasonal rains, seemed a formidable obstacle. Yet, for Genghis Khan, every natural challenge was an opportunity to demonstrate ingenuity. Using portable bridges, rafts, and disciplined cavalry maneuvers, the Mongols crossed with startling efficiency. This wasn't mere brute force. It was the application of strategy to terrain, timing, and psychology. Witnesses described seeing the Mongol banners ripple across the riverbanks, an image that would haunt their memories for years.
As the Khan pushed further west, he encountered empires that believed themselves untouchable. Cities rich with gold, armies trained in conventional warfare, and leaders confident in centuries-old defenses. Yet the Mongols' adaptability confounded all expectations. When faced with heavily armored cavalry or fortified citadels, they employed deception, feigned retreats, sudden night assaults, and the integration of local knowledge gained from captives. Genghis Khan understood that the West could not be subdued by force alone. It required observation, intelligence, and the subtle manipulation of fear. The conquest of Bukhara was emblematic of this approach. The city, adorned with magnificent minarets and bustling markets, had a reputation for impenetrable defenses. Genghis Khan offered terms of surrender, emphasizing the benefits of submission, safety for citizens, preservation of wealth, and integration into the vast Mongol trade network. But pride blinded the rulers. When Bukhara resisted, the Mongols acted swiftly and decisively. Catapults shattered walls, cavalry sealed exits, and the city fell. Yet the Khan showed pragmatic mercy, sparing artisans and merchants to rebuild the city under Mongol oversight, securing both loyalty and economic benefit. This journey westward was not just a test of military might, it was a test of endurance and leadership. Genghis Khan led from the front, riding alongside his warriors through snowstorms, scorching deserts, and unfamiliar terrain. His presence inspired confidence, but also instilled fear. Soldiers fought not only for territory, but for the honor of serving a leader who understood hardship intimately, who had once survived the treacherous steppes as a child, and now commanded continents with vision and resolute. Through these campaigns, the Mongol Empire became more than a collection of conquered lands. It was a network of trade routes, fortified posts, and carefully managed cities that linked the East and West in a web of influence.
Knowledge, artisans, and captives moved along these routes, enriching the empire while reinforcing Genghis Khan's reputation as a ruler who combined destruction with organization. The Western advance also brought new challenges, unfamiliar climates, diverse cultures, and the looming threat of alliances among neighboring empires. Yet Genghis Khan's strategies were adaptive. Diplomats accompanied armies, carrying messages of both warning and negotiation. Every victory was calculated not only to secure territory, but to weaken resistance and create a network of intelligence that would guide future campaigns. By the end of this phase of expansion, Genghis Khan's dominion had extended from the eastern frontiers of China to the fringes of Persia and the Caucasus. His army, once a small band of steppe riders, had transformed into a sophisticated force capable of coordinated sieges, rapid mobility, and psychological warfare across continents. The path to the West was not merely a military campaign, it was a declaration. The Mongol Empire was no longer a regional power. It was a force capable of reshaping civilizations, redirecting trade, and influencing the political landscape of the known world. And as Genghis Khan paused to survey the lands now under his control, he knew that the journey was far from over. The horizons beyond the Caspian and the deserts of Persia beckoned, promising both peril and unparalleled opportunity. In the hearts of those who witnessed it, the westward advance became legend, the unstoppable Mongol horde, a force of nature led by a man whose vision transcended the boundaries of empires, a leader whose ambitions were as vast as the steppes themselves.
Chapter 10. Legacy of the Khan. The sun dipped low over the endless steppes, casting long shadows across the Mongol Empire, a dominion that stretched from the eastern deserts of China to the rugged mountains of Persia and the fringes of Eastern Europe. Genghis Khan, now older and scarred from decades of relentless campaigns, rode slowly across the plains he had conquered, his mind far from the physical landscape before him. He was thinking of the future, of the empire that would endure long after his final breath, and of the story that would be told for generations. The journey of his life had been one of unimaginable hardship and extraordinary triumph,
Born as Temüjin in 1162 to a minor Mongol tribe, he had been thrust into survival from the very beginning. The loss of his father, the betrayal of allies, the harsh winters and scarcity of food, these were not mere obstacles, but the crucible that forged his character. Every defeat he endured had been transformed into a lesson in strategy, resilience, and leadership. And now, decades later, the scattered tribes of the steppe were united under a single banner, and the Mongol cavalry commanded fear and respect across continents. Genghis Khan's greatest legacy was not simply the land he conquered, but the system he created to govern it. He codified laws, established efficient communication networks, and encouraged trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road. Cities that had once fallen under siege were rebuilt as thriving hubs of commerce and knowledge, demonstrating that his vision encompassed more than destruction. It included creation, governance, and stability. The empire was a living entity, held together not only by the fear of the Khan's wrath, but also by a complex system of loyalty, meritocracy, and shared purpose.
Yet, the empire was not without its shadows. Tales of massacres, burned cities, and relentless campaigns haunted both the conquered and the conquerors. Genghis Khan understood that fear could be a tool as powerful as any sword, and he wielded it judiciously to prevent rebellion and maintain order. Still, for those who served him, loyalty was rewarded generously, and talent was recognized regardless of origin. Scholars, engineers, and artisans were welcomed into the fold, contributing to an empire that was remarkably sophisticated for its time. As the Khan looked westward, he knew that his work was far from over. The expansion into distant lands, the management of diverse peoples, and the establishment of dynasties were tasks that would extend beyond his lifetime. He had forged a system that could endure the trials of succession and the pressures of geography, leaving the future in the hands of his sons and generals, who were trained in the same principles of discipline, strategy, and vision that had guided him. Genghis Khan's influence would ripple across history, reshaping civilizations, trade routes, and military tactics for centuries. The nomadic warriors of the steppe, once underestimated by the great empires of the world, had demonstrated that mobility, intelligence, and unity could challenge even the most powerful states. His name would become synonymous with both fear and respect, a symbol of unyielding determination and transformative leadership.
As night fell and the stars shimmered above the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan reflected on the path that had brought him here. He had begun as a boy in a world of treachery and hardship, and through courage, cunning, and relentless ambition, he had risen to shape the destiny of nations. His story was one of paradox, destruction paired with creation, brutality tempered by governance, ambition balanced by strategy. And so the man who had once been Temüjin, the boy of the steppes, became Genghis Khan, the great Khan of the Mongols. His legacy was not measured merely in conquered lands or vanquished enemies, but in the enduring empire he built, the laws he codified, and the vision that would continue to inspire leaders, warriors, and dreamers for generations. The steppes were silent now, save for the wind whispering through the grass, carrying with it the echoes of a lifetime that had reshaped the world. Genghis Khan's journey was complete, yet his story was eternal, etched into history, remembered across continents, and immortalized in the legacy of an empire that would endure far beyond his mortal years. The great Khan had passed, but his spirit of vision, ambition, and relentless pursuit of destiny would forever ride across the endless plains of history.